There have been Earthbound theories and Mother 3 theories before, very good ones in fact. But today I plan to bring you the most in-depth, fact-based theory that will answer every and all questions that have ever been asked about the connections of the games. And I'm not kidding. Buckle up, you're in for quite a ride. Today I have a theory for you that may just be one of the biggest ones that ever came out of the Mother universe. So I will not only explain exactly what happened with Porky from the first time we see him in the opening of Act 1 in Earthbound to the closing of Chapter 8 in Mother 3 and beyond, but I'll explain the true meaning to the end of Earthbound and explain how Earthbound had to happen in order for Mother 3 to end the way it did. It all sounds fairly cryptic now, but don't you worry, it's about to blow your socks off. I have a lot to get to, so let's get started. You may want to grab a pad of paper and a pen to keep up, because I'm going to be jumping all over the place. Okay, let's begin. Earthbound opens up with us meeting Ness, the quiet protagonist, and Porky, the loud, perhaps obnoxious neighbor who refers to himself as Ness's best friend. The two of them, with the help of Ness's dog, head towards a recently crash-landed meteorite to help find Porky's brother, Picky, for whom we meant to believe has run off. Upon arrival at the meteor, they find Picky, who informs us that his cowardly brother Porky ran away from him, leaving him to mosey around the meteorite and subsequently fall asleep. At this point, we realize Porky is a big fat liar and a bit selfish. Their departure from the space dock is halted by a low buzz. As they hone their attention, they see a beetle emerge from the meteorite. The beetle, named Buzz, tells the three boys that he is from 10 years in the future, and he has forged his way through time and space in order to warn the Chosen One that Gygas, the universal cosmic destroyer and center of all to the horror of eternal darkness, has a plan that is about to be set into motion, a plan that ultimately leads to the time where all is devastation. That is 10 years in the future, the time where Buzz left. We'll revisit that later. The three boys, just hearing some heavy stuff, head back home, probably to cry, when they are suddenly confronted by Starman Jr., an entity from the time Buzz left, who is one of Gygas' henchmen. Starman Jr. has followed Buzz through time and is hoping to thwart his plans. Buzz is able to defeat Starman Jr., which means Starman Jr. will never be able to return to Gygas to report whether or not he was victorious, and we can confidently assume that Gygas goes on his original plan unhindered, which is to capture and destroy all. It's bad. It's bad. We'll revisit that later as well. Porky and Ness lead Buzz back to Porky's house, and that's where good old Buzz meets his demise from the business end of an angry woman's hand. Buzz dies after finishing off what he has to say about Ness's destiny, and Porky and Picky are taken upstairs and smacked by their father, who has just recently verbally degraded them. This is the first time the player has some compassion for Porky. He may not be the most empathetic character we've ever met, but we find some human qualities in him and can relate to him, at least on some level. Even creator Shikasato Itoi says that Porky has no friends and most likely hung out with Ness all the time, and that his parents were intentionally horrid. This is also when we can get an inside look at why Porky is the way he is. Several medical journals relate child abuse, both physical and emotional, to depression, and also find a direct correlation of that of aggression or bullying. Porky's attitude is his self-defense mechanism. He uses it to cover up his depression and aggression towards his parents and their neglect for him and his brother. After all, both boys went missing moments after a meteorite crashed to the earth, and the first thing the parents do is scold them when they finally return home. That's messed up. Anyway, back to the story. We can fast forward a little bit. Ness takes off on his journey, that's the one we play through, and he starts a search for the 8 sanctuary spots and begins to get his power to destroy Gygas. Meanwhile, Porky skips town and ends up in Happy Village, where he joins a cult, becomes a high priest alongside those crazy blue people. And again, there are countless studies that link child abuse with the need to be part of some sort of family group, often negative, gang-like, or cult-like, similar to these blue crew. It's here he kidnaps Paula with the intention of performing a human sacrifice. Paula sends out her beacon call to Ness, who consequently comes to her aid. After Paula is saved, we see Porky return to Ness to offer his gratitude and make amends. Ness doesn't say anything because he is the intentional, silent protagonist. Porky gets upset because of this, showing that he has essentially hurt his feelings, and he runs off. Now, I know a lot of you watching commenting that the American version Porky psychs Ness out and he never apologizes, but it stated in several references that it was a falsely translated between the original Japanese version titled Mother 2. Translations issues are also the reason I've decided to refer to Porky as Porky and not Pokey as he's called in the English version.
Keeping it canon.
Anyway, Porky leaves with his feelings hurt, knowing that Ness, his once best friend, has betrayed him, makes him more detached emotionally, and begins to pursue bigger and better things, skipping right over the creepy Threed and going straight into Foresight. There he finds a job in the mayor's office with his dad, and the whole family, minus Picky, hang out and belittle everyone around them. Now, while Porky is gaining power, Ness is traveling through Threed, Grapefruit Falls area, Saturn Valley, Belch's factory, the desert for a while, and Foresight. Ultimately, Ness reaches the top floor of the Monotoli building and realizes that Mayor Monotoli has been brainwashed by the Mani Mani statue, which was under Gyges' power, and that Porky was taking advantage of the whole situation. Porky realizes the gig is up, flees the building in a helicopter. We'll hit the pause button there for a sec. Knowing Porky, we know that he's heading to find some sort of power. He's never been one to just hide out. He has always gravitated towards needing power, but on top of that, we have to remember he was there to hear what Buzz said. Whether or not he's tried to follow Ness's steps around the sanctuary spots, he's still aware that there is some all-evil being that's going to appear somewhere in the future. Even though he mentions that the prophecy wasn't aimed towards him, Porky isn't one to just stand by and become a slave. This is the part of the story where things start to get a bit diluted from our antagonist buddy Porky, as he doesn't appear on screen again until the very end of the game. And this is really the start of where the theory takes off. Let me state the constants so we know exactly what we have to work with. Ness's journey from here to we see mention of Porky again is as followed. Ness leaves Foresight, heads towards Threed with a Runaway 5's bus, takes a Skyrunner to Winters, goes from Winters to Summers, crashes, then from Summers gets drugged for who knows how long, Pooh shows up to join them, the four of them go back to Foresight, then back to Summers where they all sail across the sea, who really knows how long that takes, when they up in Scaraba, where they play around for a while, then go through Pyramids, Pooh goes away, and the three of them go into Dungeon Man, solve Dungeon Man, walk said Dungeon Man around to a lake, get back into Dungeon Man, take a submarine to Deep Darkness, where they use the Hawkeye to see in the dark, Pooh comes back, trudge through the swamp, find a helicopter that Porky takes off the roof of Foresight. Those are the facts. Do you know what part of that is not facts? The time that actually takes to complete that. There are speedrunners who can jump screens and finish the game in a couple hours, and there are some that play for the first time and beat the whole thing in just under 1,000 hours. Go me! Woo! So it's fair to say that the time elapsed is very ambiguous, and that's important to remember. It's also important to note what happened directly after they discover that crashed helicopter. Ness and his crew end up in Tenda Village, where they mosey around a bit before realizing they have to find a book of overcoming shyness. So they leave the cave, and that's when they find out that Apple Kid, Dr. and Donuts, and several others have been kidnapped. We don't officially know by who yet, but come to find out, it's the Starmen, which, as you remember, are Gyges' top-ranking minions. Remember all that. I'll get to how it all ties in. Flashback a bit. Porky leaves Foresight in his fancy helicopter. He heads away from town. Now, the official direction is unknown. What we do know is that the majority of all the other locations in the game are rather third-worldy, except for Summers, which is more vacation destination-y. Since he is clearly on his way to acquire more power, he isn't looking to put any effort, especially time, into any of these locations. He would also be able to visit a lot more places than Ness would have in the same time because of that helicopter. Since Deep Darkness is rather obscure, it's fair to assume that by the time he got there, he most likely had exhausted most of the other choices. His options are thin. He's met all the people with influence that there may be, but not big enough populations that'll worship him as the all-powerful. Now, are you ready for it? It was on Porky's journey to find more power that he is shot down and kidnapped by the emerging Starmen. He didn't crash as the game implied, and this is how I know that. After Ness is alerted of the kidnapping of Dr. and Donuts and Apple Kid, he immediately goes to Winters, where Starmen have taken over the caves under Stonehenge. Now, the Stonehenge base is a new addition. I know it existed as a location, but it being built up and developed is a new occurrence. Walking through it, we realize that. In addition to the structure, clearly it would have taken quite some time to compile a full room of Earthboundians, such as Dr. and Donuts, Apple Kid, and all their friends. It was very intentional that these people were kidnapped and stored in that tubes for preservation. You want to learn from them, harvest them, and use them to your advantage, or at least keep them away from banding against you. And who could help you find those special people? It's someone in power, someone who's easily influenced by more power. The one guy, other than Ness, that knows the Starmen exist and know their intentions, and who their boss is. The Starmen shot down Porky in his helicopter, most likely not knowing significance, and Porky used his knowledge of the people and places around the world and persuasive personality to gain the trust of the Starmen. Porky tells Starmen where they can find the people they're looking for, and he knows that once they're captured, his old pal, Ness, is sure to follow. I also imagine that Porky would have dropped hints of hearing about Buzz, or at least that he's aware of the game plan, which would have solidified his place in the trust circle as well. Fast forward to when Ness and his team show up at the Stonehenge base. Porky has already moved on. He knows Ness is going to win, going off of the prophecy, and how seamlessly dense the Starmen are. Ness, of course, does defeat them, and that's when Porky makes his next move. He finds Dr. Andonis and Mr. Saturn, who are beginning their construction of the phase shifter, convinces them to let him test it, and just like that, he's gone from the Earthbound dimension as we know it. He traveled to Gyges while Ness and his party are still finishing up their sanctuary spots. When it comes time for Ness and his friends' souls to move to the future to save the world, they leave as planned and fulfill the prophecy, but not before confronting Porky for the very last time. Porky now works for Gygus. He knows what Buzz said. He learned what he had to learn from the Starman that kidnapped him and uses power to influence and malevolence to get his in with evil Gygus. When we see Porky, he is in his physical form. It's not his soul like Ness and his friends inside that infamous Spider-Mech suit. And I believe that Spider-Mech suit is an extension of the Phase Shifter because he states that he's going to leave for another era towards the end of the first part of the final battle. Why reinvent the wheel when you've arrived in an interdimensional machine already? Ness starts off by fighting Porky. Porky goes down fairly quickly, but makes one final offensive move that seals the fate of all that exists in the Earthbound universe. He turns off the Devil's Machine. Here's a quote. Gygus cannot think rationally anymore. He isn't even aware of what he's doing now. His own mind was destroyed by his incredible power. What an almighty idiot, Porky says. Porky essentially unchained the most evil entity in the universe and switched off its control. Ness has to fight him now, not just because he's the ultimate evil, but because he is no longer making rational decisions. He's becoming unstable and will eventually implode. It's inevitable, which ain't good. All Porky has to do is stand at the sidelines and let Ness defeat the only thing holding him back. As Ness fights Gygus, Porky chimes in several times to narrate what's happening. In this bizarre dimension, you four are the only ones fighting for justice. And here you stand, waiting to be burned up with the rest of the garbage in the universe. That's sad, I can't help. He's coaxing Ness to fulfill the prophecy because Porky has figured out what happens next. Ness ultimately defeats Gygus, but not without Porky's one last chime-in. Now it's gonna seem like I'm running away, but perhaps I'll just sneak away to another era to think about my next plan. It's a good bet we'll see each other again. All right, I'll be seeing ya. So now which one of us do you think is the cool guy? He leaves. We'll come back to him in a bit. So Ness and friends' souls return to the past, and it's game over, happy ending, right? So we're meant to think. But that's not how it happened. You see, as soon as Gygus was defeated, the timeline that Earthbound sits on no longer exists. Buzz goes to the past to warn Ness of Gygus' ruling, which occurs after he is defeated at the end of Earthbound. Meaning that since he is destroyed before the all-is devastation phase, then Buzz never has to flee and find Ness. Ness never goes on his quest, and everything we just played through becomes only a memory. Well, a memory for only Porky, which will make more sense in a sec. As Gygus disappears, so does Ness, Paula, Jeff, and Pooh. But what about the post-game portion when you receive letters from your friends and wander the Earth revisiting all the people you've saved? I hear you yelling at the screen. Well, that is the proverbial life flashing before your eyes. It doesn't happen. All of their families and friends have just spent all their power praying for them, and they won. But their souls aren't returning to the place it came from because that place doesn't exist anymore. Let me explain. Paula was never kidnapped and still lives peacefully at the preschool. Jeff eventually leaves the winter school and never meets his father. And Pooh eventually becomes heir to the throne, and no one is the wiser to the events that transpired. As Porky leaves the cave of the past, he says he's going to bounce around dimensions and whatnot, but really, he has one stop to make first. He returns to the Earthbound dimension for the last time. He returns before Buzz shows up, before the meteorite does or does not hit, and before he knocks on Ness's door. He writes a note to Ness and sneaks it to his brother Picky. He then kidnaps Dr. and Donuts, threatening harm to his son if he doesn't comply. A son that Dr. and Donuts abandoned years ago, a son that will never find him because Jeff will never be looking, because Paula will never call to him. Then Porky and Dr. and Donuts, that one man he needs to sustain the Spider-Mech, disappear into the 4th and 5th dimension. We'll discuss the 4th dimension shortly and how it pertains to the game, but first let me explain the post-credit ending in Earthbound. As I started this video, I walked everyone through the opening scene. Earthbound opens to us meeting Ness, the quiet protagonist, Porky the loud, perhaps obnoxious neighbor. He refers himself as Ness's best friend. Then Ness and Porky, with the help from Ness's dog, head towards the recently crashed meteorite to help Porky find his Picky, whom they meant to believe ran off. Upon arrival at the meteor, they find Picky, who is informed that his cowardly brother Porky ran away from him, leaving him to mosey around the meteorite and suddenly essentially fall asleep. Stop there. Post-credit Ness is awakened by a similar knock on the door. This time, or should I say, in this timeline, it's Picky. He says Porky left a note. Come and get me, loser. Spankety, spankety, spankety. And then the game ends with a question mark. But this is what really happened. Ness had already woken up earlier like the entire game started. He walked to check out the meteorite. And it can be argued whether or not Buzz was attached to the meteorite. The meteorite may have still landed, regardless of Buzz. And then again, like before, he returns home and goes back to bed. All of that isn't seen. It would be a waste of time to replay. Suddenly, Ness is woken by a knock at the door, and it's Picky. Why is it Picky? Because Porky is missing, and has been since Picky went to bed, or whenever the last time he saw his brother. That's not important. Porky and Picky never went to investigate the meteorite together. Porky never got scared and left Picky, and Porky never had to use Ness to help find his brother. Picky just wakes up, sees a letter addressed to his brother's best friend, and delivers it. He doesn't know at the time that he's never going to see his brother again. But cheer up, he was always in Porky's shadow. I believe that in this timeline, Picky thrives as the protagonist. Ness won't have a journey to be destined to. Heck, maybe it'll be Picky's quest to find out what happened to his brother, though he'll never find him. So Porky just witnessed Gygus get defeated, or skipped out a moment before he collapsed, and willingly left his former best friend to begin a new timeline. Again, to recap, since Gygus was defeated before Buzz made his trip to tell Ness of the prophecy, Ness never begins his quest, meaning that ultimately nothing that happens in the game of Earthbound takes place. And since Porky's physical body went 10 years into the future, whereas Ness and friends' souls went, and Porky left the Earthbound dimension before Gygus was defeated, when the Earthbound timeline refreshes, Porky is able to escape the new timeline, and the one that Ness is now part of will only involve past memories of Porky. He has wiped himself off the plane in time for that moment on. Man, thank God for visual aids. Anyway, Porky kidnapped Dr. and Donuts and took off to another era or dimension. Now let me throw some science into the mix and explain how time travel would be possible. A lot of people have heard of the fourth dimension, and when asked what it is, simply say that the fourth dimension is time, and then grin brightly and strike a pose. But what does that mean exactly? Frankly, I didn't know what it meant until I researched it too, so I too was guilty of the grin and pose. The fourth dimension is time, but in correlation with the three fields appearing throughout the line of time. I'll show you an example. Say you come up against a wall blocking your path. It's too high to climb and too long to go around. If you travel along the fourth dimension, however, which is time, then you can move to a time on that fourth dimensional plane where that wall didn't exist, walk to where the opposite side would eventually be, and then move back along the fourth dimensional plane, standing in that same three-dimensional space, and when you return to the start point, you will be on the other side of the wall. The fifth dimension is simplified in a lot of sci-fi movies as being alternative universes, fourth dimensions that lay in the right angle to our fourth dimension. Think of it like in Back to the Future. When Biff gets the almanac and Doc shows how the timelines have skewed, those would be two parallel sets of fourth dimensions if both 1985 scenarios were happening at the same time, oblivious to each other. Rick and Morty is all about time traveling across the fifth and fourth dimensions as well. So to explain what Porky has been doing, he left the time of the Gygus battle, traveled along the fourth dimension back to the time past when Ness and his crew loaded their souls into the phase distorter, past before all the occurrences happened in the Earthbound game, and to the night of the meteor crash. He plants the letter to Ness with Picky, then travels to Winners, kidnaps Dr. and Donuts, and travels along the fifth dimension away from the Earthbound dimension, looking for more opportunities for power. And to clarify, if Porky was to go back to the Earthbound dimension, he would cease to exist because his physical form left the timeline before the loop reset. So if he dropped by to see his family or Ness, it would put a tear in the time-space continuum and collapse the universe. Not a pleasant experience. So Porky is forced to find another dimension to which reside. Eventually, and I will use that term very loose for now, Porky ends up in the Nowhere Islands. And this is why I think he ends up there. First off, from the day we meet Porky until he leaves the Gygus battle, he is always hungry for power. It starts off as an innocent power over his peers with his silver tongue and quick talk, and escalates to his cult interaction and comes to a head when he's side by side with the most powerful thing ever, a thing that is referred to as fear itself. He then forces this all-powerful being to collapse in on itself and takes off across a plane of space-time for dimensions unknown. So Porky has undoubtedly developed a bigger ego since we've seen him last. Now, the Nowhere Islands are called peaceful and innocent on more than one occasion, and nothing is more enticing to a mastermind of evil than those two attributes. He lands there, establishes his pork army, and begins to play God, experimenting on animals, creating hybrids, and killing people willy-nilly along the way. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's understand his motive for the pork army and his behavior on these islands. It's never revealed if the pork army is people, or like Star Wars drones, or robots of some kind, so for giggles, we'll just assume they are people that Porky is brainwashed into following him. Porky established a new Pork City, declares himself king of the islands, and surrounds himself with things that only a child would enjoy being surrounded by. We are often told on several occasions that he still retains the mind of a child. He wants an arcade, an amusement park, a giant treehouse, a movie theater, and some of the only attractions in the city. No hospital, no bank, no grocery store, just fun things. He is still a child because he hasn't aged, because time isn't the same for him. He is above time, essentially. One of his big quotes states, "I've gone through time and space so many times I haven't aged like a normal person. Who knows? I might be 1,000 years old, or even 10,000 years old. But despite that, I am still the same kid at heart." Isn't that funny? Now, he isn't 1,000 or 10,000 years old, like he says he is. That is for sure. So stop thinking that is ridiculous. That's like the only thing taken literally from other three that I've seen collectively. And it's the most ridiculous thing to hitch your horse to. So stop that. Just drop it. In saying that, he means that since he has traveled across so many planes of existence, along the fifth dimension, to a place, and then along that place's fourth dimension, that 5,000 years into the future could happen in a matter of seconds for him. Time to him is as unreal as the word moment is to us. It's all relevant. So he spent a lot of time wandering through space and time and finally found an island that was under-established, easy to manipulate, and a place that he could set up things and just play God until he ran out of fun. But like any kid, he becomes homesick. Even Ness gets homesick during Earthbound, and Porky Porky sure isn't immune. Unfortunately for Porky, he will never be able to see his parents or friends again, due to the closed Earthbound time loop that we talked about earlier. So he makes up for that fact by surrounding himself in things that remind him of home. He names his army the Pork Army after his name, but designs their look off of what his mother used to call him. She directly asks Ness if you're looking for my pig son, and that he wandered around, wording it wander rather than walking, implying more of an animal sense than boy. I'm guessing Porky was often referred to as a pig by his mother, and since Porky was such a narcissist, I'm sure he didn't take it negatively, more like a pet name, pun intended. Plus, I previously stated that Itoy himself said that Ness was Porky's only friend. Ness wasn't one of a name caller, I can presume, so Porky would have only heard himself be called a piggy from his mother. So he models the pig soldiers after his likeness, a nickname, created an entire restaurant, waitresses that were modeled after his mother, but that still wasn't enough. He created a giant tower, one that he keeps expanding on, adding one ridiculous floor after the next. There's more. He knows his new world doesn't feel like home, so he has to create items that remind him of home, so he creates replicas of items from the Earthbound universe. The following is a list of items that appear both in Earthbound and Mother 3. The teddy bear in the nursery room, jukebox in the nursery room, the theme from the general store play bowl in the jukebox in the nursery room, the sarcophagus in the nursery room, Ness's yo-yo in the machine in the nursery room, the rejuvenation machine, waitresses in the New Pork City's Porky's mom. One waitress refers to Dung Beetle as a reference to Buzz Buzz. There's a magazine article found by Lucas and Boney in the storage room. It's the same as in the purchasable house in Earthbound. There's a Franklin badge. In the theater, there is a picture of Jeff, the monkey, and Tessie, Ness, Paula, Jeff, the circus tent, Ness, Paula, Jeff, Master Belch, Ness alone, giving the peace sign to Forsyth, Jeff, Ness, Paula, Pooh, Media Crater, Ness, Paula, and Dungeon Man, Ness with two Mr. Saturns, and then the boat trip, towards the very end of the game, we see Tessie, a taxicab, a payphone, home phone, Magic Ant phone, flying saucer, eraser, pencil eraser, helicopter pre-crash, the Dungeon Man, city bus, ATM, submarine, Ness's bike, phase distorter pre-crash, Pokey's old mecha suit, and there's that contact too, I think, in there. I forgot on my list here, but I think there's a contact. Okay, whatever. Okay, so I saw this list and I had some serious questions regarding some items. So let me narrow the list down. These are the items that he would have seen without any further explanation, on the street, in magazines, in passing, etc. Now the remaining items, the photo of Jeff, Monkey, and Tessie, the photo of Ness, Paula, Jeff, Master Belch, Tessie by herself in the Moat Museum, Magic Ant phone, the eraser, the pencil eraser, the Dungeon Man, and the submarine. These items we have to go a bit more in depth with, and they actually help prove my theory to this point. Both the photo in the theater with Jeff, Monkey, and Tessie and the pencil eraser are visible in photos taken by the Fuzzy Pickler in Earthbound, meaning that there is some kind of physical evidence it happened. So let's get rid of those. Of the ones remaining, Tessie may have had other photos taken of her. Heck, there was so many people on the shoreline with binoculars, one of them must have seen something, so we'll knock that out too. The two that really aren't that important either way are Dungeon Man and the submarine. Originally, I had argued that the submarine launched from inside Dungeon Man, presumably after Porky's helicopter crashed in deep darkness, so there would be no way for him to see it, but there probably wasn't just one submarine in the Earthbound world. So the submarine's place in the museum was similar to that of the taxicab or the ATM, just an item, whatever. And though he didn't come in contact with the Dungeon Man, if Porky was flying overhead in a helicopter, it must have grabbed his eye as being something extraordinary. So knock those two out. That leaves only 3 items. The photo of Ness, Paula, Jeff, and Master Belch, the Magic Ant phone, and the eraser. I honestly don't have anything for the picture. It makes no sense. There was never a photo taken. There was no way, while flying overhead, Porky could have seen a hidden base behind a waterfall. No answer for the photo. Turn the video off. I'm incompetent. Turn it off. Turn the video off. Turn it off. Okay, you still there? Good. Before we forget about that one, remember the photo where Ness is alone in Forsyth from the theater? Well, the actual photo taken by the Fuzzy Pickle guy contains Ness, Jeff, and Paula. I can write off the Belch photo as an altered version of something Porky heard about. Maybe he was intrigued by the thought of his buddy fighting a burp. No clue. But I'm okay with that. So that leaves me to explain 2 remaining items. Are you nervous about that? Think I'm going to cheap out, not be able to give you good enough reason for their existence? Well, think again. First, we'll talk about the eraser. The eraser is a special item that Apple Kid makes for Ness. When he touches it to a giant eraser statue, the statue disappears. He uses it in the Stonehenge base to gain access to the cave. But how would Porky ever have seen it? Well, if you remember back to part 1 of my theory when I talk about how the Starman kidnapped Porky, his knowledge of the eraser makes this entire scenario fact. It has to. Apple Kid calls Ness on his portable phone and tells him about his new invention, the eraser, just moments before he is kidnapped by the Starman and taken to the Stonehenge base. The only possible way that Porky would have been able to know of the eraser's existence was if he in fact was with those starmen at the time of the kidnapping. There is no other way of cheating around this artifact being in the museum. It wasn't something that anyone would have photographed. It appeared and disappeared in a matter of minutes, but Porky would have retained it in his memory, some weird invention unlike anything else. So that's that one. Now there's one last item, the one that took the most digging, the Magic Ant phone. Magicant is a realm that is thought to be contained inside Ness's subconscious. Once he visits all 8 sanctuary spots, he loses consciousness and is transported to it. So how could it be possible for someone else to see a phone designed from someone else's subconscious? Well, simple enough. It's not a subconscious at all, but another dimension. It's even stated in the game. Magicant is the realm of the mind. Not a mind, singular, but the mind. Magicant is a dimension that has countless variations. It projects a universe of what's inside the mind of the person that's part of it. Porky was present in Ness's Magicant, stating that he wishes the two of them could stay best friends forever. It also contains so many other people and characters, which we could assume would be unique for each person who enters the realm. Now let's bring it back to facts. The only character that's new to the world of Magicant is the Flying Men. And I believe they exist in every variation of Magicant, and they are, to an extent, the way that the Magicant helps us find our way. Much like the Flying Men help us overcome the enemies there. And they have a very strange connection that links the realm of Magicant to that of Mother 3. The song from Earthbound that you hear in the Flying Man's house is a song entitled The Jolly Flying Men, which is a good title. The song actually has lyrics, even though we don't hear them in the game. One of which lyrics from the song is, "Life is but a moment, a worthless grain of sand." Though one could stop and correlate the metaphor between Porky's time travel and his ironic state, the lyrics connect deeper. There is an enemy in Mother 3 called the Negative Man who recites the same line as you fight him. A character there's nothing but sadness and, well, negative. He is the connection of the worlds. The Negative Man's experience with Magicant left him at a permanent recital of this line, and that is clearly weighing on him. That at least proves that it's more than just Ness's subconscious, but a physical dimension that others can travel to. It's fitting to say that the Negative Man also references the worthless protoplasm, an enemy that appears in the first Dungeon Man as well as the Forsyth department store. That would make the Negative Man's reference cross 3 dimensions: Mother 3, Magicant, Earthbound proper. That concludes the connections of the game and Porky's motivation for the army and how he ended up at the Nora Islands. But what about the end? What happens at the end of Mother 3? Well, this is my complete theory. I think that Porky was traveling across the 4th and 5th dimensions. He was, ever so slightly, tearing the space-time continuum. When he arrives at the islands and settles in, I think that's what started the Needle Countdown. The reason this dimension was so fragile and originally kept so unappealing was to mask the fact that it could lead the universe to reset. But now that Porky went and overloaded the island, he sparked the beginning of the end. We see that Dr. Donuts and Mr. Saturn, who was just another Mr. Saturn from this dimension, not the original dimension, admit that they feel horrible to having assisted Porky all this time and construct a fail-safe device that they know will stop him in his tracks. Now, the final battle is eerie if you look at it with the knowledge that you have now. Porky is exhausted. The time since the Earthbound timeline is lost. It's been at least 3 years since Porky has been rooted in the Nora Islands, and he's exhausted. He has mentioned how he's still a child at heart, but appears to be old and haggard. Though he hasn't aged much, that's important to remember. He has reached his breaking point mentally and physically, unable to put much effort in. He plays with Lucas and friends as they ascend the tower, but it's a moot point because he knows that it's all going to come to an end soon. During the final battle, he talks about himself in the third person. Now do you see? Now do you understand the sadness Master Porky bears now that he's godlike? He witnessed what Gygus went through. He knows that you can only get so powerful before you get burned, and he's ready to let go. So he climbs, which is important, climbs into the absolute safe capsule, never to be harmed. But of course we know the catch, the protected one can never be released. But you're all smarter than that now, because you know all about the 4th dimension. He can move along the 4th dimension to the time where the absolute safe capsule didn't exist, and move outside of the spot, and then continue his journey. Because, after all, he climbed inside. He didn't attach himself to it. He's separate from it. Though he can't escape, he won't do it. He's given up. He's excited to see how the universe resets itself. It even hints at his happiness in the very last second of the game, when you're bumbling in the dark. As Porky's Pig Army music plays, he seems to be excited what's next. Maybe he'll see Ness again after all. So, what do you think of the theory? I sure put a lot of time into it. I actually had to read on top of actually playing the games. I almost hit a breaking point. But if you did like it, click like at the bottom so I know. And go ahead and slap that subscribe button just for funsies. And if you're interested, check out my other Earthbound theory. That theory is entirely philosophical and about how Earthbound affects us personally. So it's just a lot less thinking and a lot more self-reflection. Thanks again, guys. Later days.